Welcome to In This Family, where I have in-depth conversations with fascinating people about mental health, family, the past, and the future. I'm Dr. Michelle K. Murray, President and CEO of Nexus Family Healing, a licensed marriage and family therapist, and your host. In This Family is presented by Nexus Family Healing. We are a national nonprofit mental health organization who helps youth and families heal from trauma and complex mental health challenges. We believe every child is worth it and every family matters. My guest today in this episode is Dessa. Dessa is a rapper, a singer, composer, and author, originally from Minneapolis. She has released 5 acclaimed solo albums, as well as several more with the rap collective Doomtree, of which she's also a member. Outside of music, she has hosted a podcast for the BBC, guest hosted Science Friday on NPR, and toured South Africa with the Minnesota Orchestra. Dessa is the author of the memoir, My Own Devices, True Stories from the Road on Music, Science, and Senseless Love. She has faced some hard times. Her family used what was available to help, and she dug into her own feelings and needs. And a note before you listen, in the interview there are references to incidents of suicide in Dessa's family. Here's a little taste of Dessa's music. This one's called Long Wave.
Panic bought a weighted blanket. I can't get up to change the channels. Lost cabin pressure in the living room. What we wanted so bad, now we have it. Still end up with parts not on the package. Just trying to put in new joints in solid bone.
Well, welcome, Dessa. I'm so excited for us to talk.
Thanks for having me.
Would love to hear your thoughts about mental health and how that has transpired, maybe in your own life and your family's life, and then just how you think about mental health in general.
My thoughts have changed a lot over the past couple of decades, and I think that's true for a lot of Americans. You know, I think the way that we talk about mental health, the way, the language that we use when we do so, the posts that we might put on social media, I think all of that has really, really changed. Some changes long overdue and welcome, and some, at least to me, not so welcome.
Say more about both of those. What you think is welcomed and what's not.
Largely, there's been a big push to overcome and undermine a lot of the stigma that's long been associated with talking about mental health. That feels good, you know? The fact that we've done a lot to burn away a lot of the shroud of shame and secrecy that surrounds that conversation. I'm thinking in my own family, to use a couple of examples, 2 of my father's brothers have died by suicide, and many years apart. And I wasn't born when the first brother, Tom, took his life, but I know that the conversation, even in the family, was really tough, not just because it's so painful and would be tough under absolutely any circumstance, but because there wasn't a lot of frameworks or a lot of models to figure out what was going on. I've heard on a couple occasions members of the family mention, we didn't really have the diagnoses that we do now, the access even to mental health as an acceptable an acceptable route for care and treatment, as opposed to kind of the last resort and fear of institutionalization, in previous generations. What wasn't available in the same way. So I think that is welcome and wonderful, that in the same way that when we understand one of our biological systems to be ailing, that immediately warrants medical attention. Hey, you busted your knee. Hey, it seems like your blood sugar is wildly out of control. That probably merits a trip to the doc for most folks if you can swing it. And I think that we've come to understand our mental well-being as a part of our lives that can similarly benefit from attention and care. Awesome.
I agree.
On the other hand, and you and I may disagree on this, I think that there's very often a cultural pendular swing, So I think that there's been maybe some overcompensation as well in some aspects, at least, of the culture. And granted, just to say it out loud, I live in the arts community, right? Which generally is known for kind of the bleeding edge of culture in a lot of ways. Not that I'm creating it, but that's kind of where I live. Progressive, vocal on social platforms, which is where, musicians spend a lot of our time. So that colors my worldview of culture, right? I'm not downing as many beers at a local DMV where the conversation, nobody's downing beers at a DMV, at a VFW, where the conversation might be really different. Although, shout out, there's one in Ottumwa, Minneapolis that I go to every once in a while. So I'm aware of the fact that I think that the U.S. is a composite of many, sometimes really, really diverse cultures with really different value sets. All that said, I think that our proclivity and eagerness to diagnose parties sight unseen without the medical licensure to do so, oh my gosh, anything from like they are absolutely a narcissistic, toxic personality, right? Also, to be honest, I think that culture exists within the therapeutic community. So, as someone who's like everybody else, I've been to a few therapists. I'm aware of the fact that money complicates stuff. And when you pay money to a therapist, which I do and have, in the past, there's a fiscal relationship there that can make things complicated. So I think a lot of folks have heard from their therapist that their partner is narcissistic more often than they've heard from their therapist that you, my patient, are clearly narcissistic. So yeah, I think that's regrettable.
You're also bringing in an element of well-being and tying together the importance of physical health with mental health, that they're not separated. And part of what I've read from your work was when you were younger, and maybe one of the times that you really bumped up against this is it really had to do with your menstrual cycles. You had a hypomanic episode, I believe, if you could talk a little, but it was cyclothymia that you were diagnosed with, right?
Yeah.
Because of the menstrual cycles. And there's such a tie between the physical health and the mental health. And sometimes people don't understand that mental health can be sparked because of physical health issues, and they're not separated.
I was chatty, sort of intellectually precocious, regrettably attention-seeking little kid. And then as I entered adolescence, got pretty moody, which, is par for the course for a lot of folks, not everybody. But
what age would this have been that you're describing?
I would say like 14.
Okay, so just
13, 14.
Really coming into the teens then.
Just coming into the teens, yeah.
Okay.
And moody, and then really deeply, deeply unhappy. And I remember it feeling, kind of mind on, like there was fire in my blood. But you only live one life. And so even now, right, I don't know how that feeling compares to the feeling that you had when you were a teenager, or the feeling that my best friend had when she was a teenager. But I will say that even if those feelings were kind of similar, it was meaningfully driving down quality of life. Now, I didn't have any of the words to say that then. I just knew that I was really, really struggling with the amount of pain that was in my body. I just was in so... If you could sort of just like, imagine a really horrible breakup or grief, right? And just flip the switch to have that feeling in your chest and circulating in your body, that anxiety and that deep... bone deep sad, that was a regular but not totally consistent feature of my adolescence. It would come and go. So every once in a while, I'd talk to my mom, like, I think I should see somebody. But then I felt okay later. And so now what am I going to do? I'm going to walk in and say, hey, I'm a pretty well-adjusted kid. I don't really have much to talk to you about in this nice mahogany office on your patent leather chair. So it was kind of intermittent enough that it self-resolved. So it didn't, at the time, warrant a trip in to see anybody. And then I remained visited by those really dark moods. So I knew that I kind of ran blue, would probably be how I put it.
How did you know that? Because you didn't have the words. You mentioned none of us really do. We know we're feeling something. We know something's going on. So how did you make sense of what that blue was, how it was different from others, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent, the same way we do now, right? All of our data, all of our knowledge that we have about how other people feel is self-reported. Even just I remember when I was in 6th grade, so this is a little younger, 11, 12, but my 6th grade teacher's father died, Patty Sandler. And I remember, I'm sure this was not permissible by school policy, but I said, do you want company over lunch? And we went to McDonald's and ate in her car. And, she was crying and I was crying in the front seat of her car. And I remember just saying something to the effect of like, I feel heavy as compared to my classmates. And I remember using the word sunny. I just don't feel as sunny, And I much preferred, to be honest, to talk to Patty about the grief that she was in. Maybe also some of that's a blooming sensitivity to it. So there might also be an elective level, right? I want to go to where this big feeling is instead of hopscotch on the playground. But I remember then gathering a data point, and also, to be honest, just, at my lowest points, feeling like I've got to I'll be back. I'm going to excuse myself. And, crying in a bathroom or something, when I'm on musical tour, or feeling like, I don't know if I'm fully capable of keeping tears or frustration inside and presenting kind of a workable, functional social facade. And as I grew older, so now I'm in my early 20s, I was really aware of that. And also I think the jokes that people were making about me indicated that they thought that I was sad, I remember one of the guys in my rap group, Sims, a great friend, every once in a while just saying, "Don't be sad at me." And my mom saying, "Gosh, why do you always write music to bleed out to?" And I think I certainly had wonderful, happy, connected days too. But I think that those really unsettled, grief-like feelings were a big part of my mental terrain. And maybe that becomes more visible and comparable with others because I'm in music, where you are making a pretty consistent report of your feelings inside, right? You're offering those pretty consistently on display. So you have an opportunity to compare them to the feelings that are inside other people.
Yeah, and that's certainly a way, your music can certainly be a way of gravitating toward those big feelings and expressing those big feelings.
They were for me, yeah. And it's one of the few fora, right? You can't sort of like stand in line at Walgreens and be like, is anyone else being consumed by fire from the inside? But you can do that on stage. And some people go, yeah, me too. So eventually in my early 20s, I was diagnosed with an ovarian tumor. And those are hard to tell if they're cancerous or not cancerous before you get them out. It's one of those. So I had my ovary removed, which is a surgery called an oophorectomy. And as is often the case in some folks, it takes a while for their body to realize, I'm working on one cylinder here. I used to have to, the remaining ovary will have to pump out enough hormones to keep the system at equilibrium, which you can do. Awesome. But it takes a minute. And in that minute, I experienced sort of like a premenopause, so a lot of sleeplessness, but also just like feeling batty, feeling really, really out of it. And I crashed a car, which is, to be totally clear, I don't know, maybe I would have done that normally too. You only live once, right? So it's hard to isolate all the variables. But I crashed a car in making a left turn poorly. It was a borrowed car. And darn it, indeed. Like this is a stressful scenario no matter what. But I think it was the way that I responded to that stress that was an indicator to my dad. I think we need to get some help that we're not getting right now. So I crashed the car. I pull over. I'm safe. The other driver is safe, but I'm tall. I'm like nearly, I'm an inch and a half shy of 6 feet, and I was curled up in the footwell of the passenger seat, kind of rocking and yelling, not yelling, but repeating, I'm so small. And I found that very embarrassing. So it would be something that I would try, even if I had those feelings, I would try to not show them to people. And when my dad came, I think he thought, you know what, this is a pretty far cry from the behavior of the daughter that I'm most familiar with. So he put me in the basement of a friend's house for safekeeping while he sorted out the car off the street, just put her here. And then I got some great help from Regions Hospital, which is in Minnesota.
And did you go inpatient, or was that just like an outpatient? What was that help?
Yeah, and I will admit that, I was trying to remind myself of the timeline. It's been long enough ago, and I was sort of out of it enough that some of the details on exact timelines are fuzzy. It was it was inpatient, but I don't think we didn't go that day. I think we was okay, let's try to get some. I don't know if we did talk therapy first, but I felt like I was really spinning out, and I remember speaking to a clinician in his office, and I remember being socially aware enough that I was I'm making a really bad impression, but I had a really hard time slowing down. So I was hey, I just want to acknowledge that I also realize that this rate of speech is really not socially appropriate. So I think both you and I could note that, and maybe that's indicative of a potential, but spitting out. And eventually I went inpatient for just a few days on the 4th floor, I think, psych ward. And it was a little weird. I think it freaked out my parents, because in some ways I was so functional some days. You know what I mean? Still intellectually present, but I felt like I was up on one skate, and I was having a hard time controlling my speech, my gestures, my behavior. And for me, that was freaking me out pretty good. So I thought I'd rather do this. This is very voluntary commitment, or whatever. I don't even know if you use that word, inpatient care. Yeah. And then that was where cyclothymia, that word, which I had never heard before, was introduced to me. And I'll say this, as I understand it, people who are seeking mental health treatment very often get a rainbow of related diagnoses. So I'll just say that's the one I got, and I haven't been back to revisit it. I don't know if it would hold. I have a copy of the DSM-5, which is dated now, on my bookshelf. So I know that diagnostic criteria change, but for me, cyclothymia was described as sort of a low-carb version of bipolar, where you can get low, really low feelings, and cyclically. Mm-hmm. You can get high, but not super high. So it was you go a little bit high and pretty low. Mm-hmm. And as I understood it, the big concern for those kind of mood issues was when you had the energy of a manic or hypomanic episode and the affect of a depressive episode, meaning I've got energy and I feel really bad, because that's where, self-harm happens.
And have you continued to experience that throughout your life as you've gotten older, or was that kind of a specific episode?
Yeah, I say that every once in a while I get those feelings again, and it reignites a little bit of sympathy, to be honest, for myself in my 20s. It's when you get if you get a migraine, or I don't know, when you burn yourself badly at the stove, you know how all consuming, it's it could just be your finger. The rest of your body presumably is fine. Or a toothache or an earache. It is so all consuming, that pain. It's hard to have a conversation. It's hard not to tone the affected area in your mouth while you're driving. It is such a big part of your mental experience that I go, God, I forgot it was this intense, right? Since your last toothache or your last, burn at the stovetop. And that's how I feel every once in a while. When I am visited by those feelings, I go, holy, God, this used to be daily or monthly, huh? Yo, poor thing. I have a lot more sympathy. Yeah, I do. And you mentioned earlier the menstrual cycles. I'll just say that, I think so much of our understanding of health generally is really best perceived in the aggregate. Okay, how does your blood pressure compare to other people's blood pressure who, are your same age range and demographic and XYZ? And of course, in mental health, we have only access to one subjective experience, and we have to try to describe with words or careful observation from the outside. So I would just say that Dr. Rush, who is the name of the clinician who treated me at regions. He did an amazing intake, meaning he interviewed me. Okay, well, most of the clinicians I'd seen before, had a legal pad on their lap and were writing stuff down. But then he called my high school and he fact checked me. And
wow, that's great.
Oh, it makes my throat hurt thinking about it. That's so much freaking work,
Yeah.
That's so much work. And I remember I had run away briefly when I was 14. And he had asked then, was there any, he was looking to see, is there any relation to the menstrual cycle? And when he asked that, it was just a minor chord of angels behind me, oh, I thought, oh my God, I remember being I was sleeping outside at the time, right under a bush or something. And I remember being on my period and how inconvenient that was. And I thought, when I broke up with Diego and wanted to move to a foreign country, I was on my period. And so now I do have sort of a rule, when I get that feeling, you're not allowed to quit a job or break up with your dude or, break a lease. We are in a big decisions freeze mode. Now, granted, can we prove that it's absolutely correlated? I just want to reiterate, I don't know. Yeah, there's just
we don't know.
We don't know. And also, one of the things that he brought up then, which might be different now, is you know what? There's not a wealth of funding. And it's also just a really complicated system. I've grown up to do some science communication. I used to have a podcast with BBC, and I've interviewed people about how pain and menstrual cycles are related, our perception of pain. And it's a complicated system. And a lot of studies are easier to do with dudes. So they do them with dudes. And so it's hard to know the extent to which data then can be extended to women, And, but yeah, it certainly seemed like there was enough of a link to take it seriously. So I had previously been on lithium and reacted badly, briefly. And I think it was an anti-seizure drug. And I found that they really suppressed word finding. Which for me was
yeah,
it was life without that isn't, to be honest, I don't know if it would be for me worth much. It's really a part of how I understand myself and the world. So he said, why don't we try to, instead of regulating your mood with mood drugs, why don't we try to regulate your hormonal cycle instead? So I'm going to put you on a mini pill. You might go hypomanic. We'll watch you carefully, your hair regions, and we'll see if that helps. And the nurse staff was great. I did get a little buzzed up, and they gave me a room that I could break curfew. You don't have you don't get belts, you don't get shoelaces because of self-harm concern, right? But they said you can stay up past 10 and we'll let you dance in this room. And so one of the nurses came in, she said, I heard you did your hair 50 times. I said, I did. Just kind of moving around. And I've been on that since. Occasionally I've hit some lows, but not the way, it's not a consistent feature of my mental experience in the way that it used to be. A couple of times, I've called a crisis line since then.
I'm assuming you mean a formal reach out to crisis line. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah.
What were the pivotal moments there? What happened?
I think in one scenario, I had that kind of return of, I don't know how to, I had the return of that feeling is how I think of it in my head. Here's that feeling. But it does feel when you adjust the brightness or the color contrast, on an old computer monitor, it feels like that. I'm still seeing the world, but some features of it are jumping up in high contrast and sharp relief. The sad parts are, right? And it just sort of seems like I'm not perceiving the connection and the good stuff at all. And everywhere I look, there is concrete evidence to reinforce a really, really dark worldview,
Yeah.
That life is essentially and only pain. And it hurts to be inside me. It just hurts to be awake. And like I said, that's blessedly rare now. But on the couple of occasions where I thought, hey, I've got that feeling. You know what? This might be a menstrual thing. Sometimes I get a big swing where it's not, I want chocolate and you're a jerk. It's nihilism is true.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Oh, that goes deep. Yep.
It does. It runs deep.
when you were describing, like talking to your mom when you were younger, of, oh, I'm just not feeling right, and your dad noticing differences,
Yeah.
was it you kind of initiating those observations with your parents, or did they ever observe and notice things with you that they brought to your attention?
There have been times when my dad has brought something to my attention, but to be honest, usually it was when I was on the upswing. So after I had my ovary out, I was clearly pretty blue. And also, to your point earlier about the connection between, our physical experience and our experience through our eye holes of the world.
Yeah.
I had lost a bunch of weight. So I was just looking pretty frail. I was looking frail after the surgery. And my dad, right, who's lost people he loves to, because of mental health struggles, I would imagine that there's a sensitivity there. I haven't pressed too hard because I don't want to spook him or press on a tender spot,
Yeah.
But I know that he goes into an all business mode that I actually find really helpful when something's really wrong. I hope I'm like him. I think I'm like him in that way. Like, I have big feelings, but usually they can wait if we're in crisis. Like, okay, I go into like a weird, Siri automata vibe. And he did that at the hospital when he visited me at Regions. I was inpatient. All right. Listening and writing down all the words, and their Latin origins and looking them up and how have these, super sweet. But later then I was recovering. I was recovering from the surgery at his house, and his wife at the time, who is still like a family member to me, she had a Nordic trek, and I was feeling well enough that I could stand and go upstairs and eat some, and I was on the Nordic track, and my dad came running down the stairs and was like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "Oh, geez, I didn't know this was like I needed permission to use this old ski machine." And he wasn't mad. He was just like, "No, what are you doing?" And I said, I was just using the Nordic track, the ski thing. And he goes, "We're going to buy you a Nordic track." I'm thinking, I don't want a Nordic track. They're so old. But he said, "That's the first time I've heard you sing. And whatever you are doing, I want that for you." I mean, really, really, really sweet. So I know that he notices and makes comment when I'm better. He's like, "What just happened? I want to do that again. I want you to do that again." And with my mom, and I could be totally wrong. I should talk to her maybe after this call. I think it's a little tougher. I think the mental health stuff is a lot harder to talk about. And maybe we have really different ideas and models of it. Obviously, as every mom and daughter, we are members of different generations, so that I'm sure plays into it. She grew up in a Puerto Rican family in the Bronx. I don't know how that informs her worldview, but I bet it does to some extent.
Yeah. Well, that's really helpful to understand maybe the differences between the way your parents would lean into it or not, and who knows why. Were you able to make sense of that as a younger person? Were you kind of aware of that? Like, okay, mom kind of handles this differently than dad. And then what was your meaning making for that?
At the time, I think I could have written down that I acknowledged it, but I don't think I would have had the amplitude right. How scary it is. My brother is 5.5 years younger than me, and he was like my little dude in a pretty serious way, like a really pretty serious way as kids. And I have a tenderness and a fondness for him that is unreplicable. And imagining something happening to Max is like obliterating to me, And I know that he's well. I know that he was visited by we talked about it later after the fact. He moved away from the family for a while and was going through it in a way that sounded not unfamiliar to me, And we're both aware, like, my dad's brothers, and in the generation above that, there was another suicide, I think, immediately before his first brothers. And so there's a history of, I don't know what, right? I don't know what those diagnoses would have been. I don't know to the extent of, circumstance and life choices and everything else, but there's a blueness of mood that I guess in the privacy of my own mind, I do very much think is mine and part of a lineage of blue moods.
You spoke about your dad having 2 brothers who died by suicide. How did you find that out?
One, when I was old enough to talk to my dad about his family. So when you're aware, I guess, I don't know when that would have been, late.
Yeah.
Early double digits, like 11, 12. And then the second suicide was, within the past 10 years. So,
Did your dad or mom or any other family members talk at length with you about that through the years? Are there, what's the folklore in the family about that? What's the meaning making in the family about that?
it's not a subject that I'll broach because it's not the one that hurts me most. It hurts my dad most. So also I don't want it to be a verboten topic. Like, if there's a memory to share, it's good or bad or neutral, I love hearing them, and I think about the conversations that I had with my late uncle, with whom I had a very sweet relationship before his passing. And I don't know that there's always meaning to make. I think it's an impulse that I have for sure. And this is what that means. And this is indicative of XYZ. And here's the pattern in which it participates. But I also think sometimes the house just caves in. And you know what I mean? The stud gave, and we don't know why. It was bad wood, it was fire, you don't get to know everything. And not because people are keeping secrets, but because it's not knowable. You can't run tape back, isolate variables. So I think that I understand it in that context, that at least to me, right? Like, I'm not a person of faith. I think that random chance does play a role in our lives, in our genetics, in where we were standing when the wave hit, in the chemistry in our heads. So I am so tender for my dad, and I try to give him space to not talk about it. But also, if family pictures come up, to try to lean in there too.
You've written about running away when you were young. What led to that?
Yeah, and so again, this is like far enough away, and I've revisited. It's like when you revisit a memory or a dream or something. I'm hyper aware by this point of like, okay, how much have I added in the recall?
Exactly.
But I do remember that feeling of, I don't know, it feels like an intolerable feeling, and so much distress and upset and pain. And I asked my parents, hey, I'm freaking out here. And I asked, is there someplace else I can go? Is there a friend's family or something that I could stay with? And I think they were like,
and I don't want to interrupt this because I don't want to, but I'm going, just when you say you were freaking out, like, what does that mean? I know that it's kind of this word salad, but it does just feel like I am wildly, I'm in so much pain. I'm in distress. I'm anxious. I mean, I wouldn't have used distress and anxiety, right? I think anxiety has come into its own in the past, in my adulthood. But I am wildly and actively unhappy. Okay.
Yeah.
So you're feeling that, and then you say to them, is there somewhere else I can
go? Yeah. So can I stay with a friend for a while? Can I stay? And I think they were just like, are you asking to move out? Like, you're 14 years old, you're in 7th or whatever, I guess, 8th or 9th grade. Like, no, you live in your house. And I think that there were some adult thoughts in my head, and there were also some really juvenile thoughts in my head, and also I am reluctant to like write off the big feelings of adolescence as somehow inauthentic. I think that, well, adults do that a lot. Like, oh, you're just a teenager. And yeah, maybe that's true. But also then, like, when adults talk, how often do we reference our teenage years? How formed and formative, do we understand them to be? How formed by and formative do we understand them to be? So I think there can be awkward. I think you can be graceless. I think that a lot of times you are overwhelmed by feelings and don't yet have the full ability to zoom the lens back to try to take stock of the overwhelming feelings that other people might have. But yeah, I'm a little defensive, to be honest, when people write off the adolescence years as just this slurry of hormone. That said, I asked if I could go someplace else. They said no. And so I decided I was going to leave. I was like sensitive enough to their feelings that I knew that would be upsetting to them, and I didn't want them to be sad. So I folded little notes that would sit on top of the lamps that they would click off at night, that would fall down when they did, that said, I'm making good choices and I'm safe, or something to that effect. Like, I'm still me. But I went and slept at a friend's house. I have long hair, or I had long hair at the time, and I cut it off and dyed it with Manic Panic that I'm sure I stole from Hot Topic at the mall. And I know that my mom put up posters because I went to a cafe called Hard Times in Minneapolis. Mm-hmm. And they pulled some up from under the counter to say, hey, just FYI, they're looking for you. But we won't hang them up. And I said, okay. But it was just for a few days, and then I stayed at like the house of a friend for a couple nights, and I ended up calling the Bridge, which is a center for youth in Minneapolis, and they specialize in populations too that are really hurting in a systemic way that wasn't part of my world. Like, I had a safe place to sleep, and I think that they provide services to a lot of people who don't. But they also provide like a space for reconciliation or meeting between kid and parents. And so we met at the Bridge. That's where I connected with my parents again, and then came home after that. But I do remember thinking when I saw my brother, oh, I messed up. Like, I hadn't factored that in. I forgot about how that would hit, and that was hard.
Wow, so that sounded like it really impacted him. Rocked his world a bit,
and
huh?
he was a pretty delicate kid at the time. He was very briefly, I don't know if he was electively mute or it just hurt him to talk when he was a kid. There was something funny in his throat, but my dad and I would teach him sign language, and I made him little books to try to teach him the alphabet. And he was attached to me in a way that like the school made accommodations for, so that he wouldn't have to spend a whole day without me. I could visit him, during the middle of the day on some days. So he was really attached to begin with, and I think that was a pretty tough blow.
Yeah. And how did your parents react to that meeting at the Bridge?
I think they were mad. My mom was mad. Like, there were swear words. My adolescence was tough. Definitely between me and my mom, and between me and my dad. I think it was really tough for everybody. I'm defensive enough to still reject the idea that it's just because I wanted parties and drugs, although I'm sure I did. But yeah, I think all three of us were really going through it, and their marriage was failing, which I didn't know at the time too. So man, talk about a tough. Tough sledding.
We've talked about your relationships with your family growing up. What about now? Are you in a relationship?
Right now, just saw a text from my dude, who is a diplomat. And we've been dating for 3 years.
Wow.
We met in Beijing, which sounds so fancy.
Oh, wow, that is.
Yeah, so I had been on a tour, and just to be totally clear, like I do not have, a legion of Chinese fans. I was on a grant-funded tour, and yeah, so he and I met in Beijing, and stayed in contact for like 4 or 5 years, and then connected when he was restationed in the U.S.
Oh, that's really great.
Yeah, he lives in D.C., where I now spend a good chunk of my time. I'm doing like an artist in residency at Georgetown. I've got a bag that stays packed, but a lot of times we're spending, our days and nights together.
Now, are there any parts of sometimes your well-being, mental health, things that you feel, does that ever pop up in your relationship?
It does. Not constantly, but he's, I've been really candid with him about, hey, this is the history as I understand it, and said the same thing I said to you. I don't know if that diagnosis would hold if I was in today. And to be honest, I'm less interested in the diagnosis than I used to be, right? Hey, this is what seems to help, and this is what seems to hurt, and this is when I've reached out for help. He's lost people to mental health issues too. So I think he's sensitive to it. I think also in a way that I really respected. He said, I won't force my ideas or even, treatment outcomes on you, but I want to be let in if you're game. I want to know what's happening, and that is sometimes difficult for me. It's been really sweet. So he did a great job. And also knowing that for all my talk about well-being and balance, I am also just stubborn and proud. I am proud, and I don't ask for help when I need it. I didn't call him when I was crying in a gym shower stall or whatever. My ego and my dignity are easily bruised. So the fact that he made a big effort to tread lightly was such a big deal to me. And so he'll ask, but not constantly, and not in a way that feels like he is anything but a partner, as opposed to, a supervisor.
When you reflect back to other relationships you've had, are there patterns that you saw yourself playing out in those relationships where you're very aware now in this current relationship, hey, I'm going to try to avoid this pattern? Definitely.
And I think most of that just has to do with learning as I go, as opposed to managing a mental health condition in any way. It's when am I a jerk? When have I acted in a way that I'm proud of? When have I been so inflexible that I've undermined something important or hurt someone else's feelings? So for me, I think trying to be mindful, particularly in the early stages of a relationship, to try to resist my very strong impulse to be likable. I like you. I want you to like me, which means, yeah, we could go to that movie that I don't really like, or yeah, I totally eat fried food all the time. Or, yeah, and you make yourself likable, which means that essentially you make an effigy of yourself that is likable. You have to stand behind it and puppeteer it. And so I'm mindful of remember to be honest and not just likable because you're building something.
Well, I really appreciate you responding to that and answering and talking about that experience, because our relationships and connections are all about mental health and well-being. I mean, you don't have to have a diagnosis. We have to navigate relationships. Humans need other people. We're designed that way. So we have to figure it out.
I'm so with that. Yeah, I think so much of our conversation about mental health centers on pathology.
Yeah.
And so little of it centers on hey, there are 1,000 ways online that you can learn how to improve your skin or your waistline or how shiny your hair is, right? We think about that in this graded way. And for mental health, I feel like we usually just talk about it when it wanders far enough off the mean to reach a diagnostic criteria, instead of hey, how to feel better every day. You can find it sometimes in health magazines and stuff, but man, we get a lot more conversation about how to get longer eyelashes.
Yeah.
And so thinking about it as something to promote well-being, flexibility, generosity in a way that doesn't emphasize consumer goods as self-care. I think we get a lot of like, you should go out for Bellinis and get your nails did with the girls, and here's the brunch that I ate. Yeah. And it's great. I love hearing on the radio when they're like, hey, here's a quick minute of deep breathing. Just pause for a second, do your thing. Is it hokey sometimes? Yes. Is it crunchy granola? Yes. Do we need it? Probably. Like, let's walk more. What does it look like to build a city that promotes mental health? Green spaces, fresh air, good food, available produce, and all the zip codes. Yeah. So I dig that.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Dessa. I've really just enjoyed this back and forth conversation and learning more about you and hearing about your experiences and how you think about it. I think people will feel really moved by some of the things that you've been talking about. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for the conversation.
You can learn more about Dessa at her website, dessawander.com. Here's a little more of her music. This one's called What If I'm Not Ready? Was I excited to talk to Dessa. Really enjoyed her energy and her insights into her own life. I experienced Dessa as having a very high capacity for caring about other people. She came across to me as being very aware of the impact that she was having on others, like her brother. She was aware of how others were feeling about what she was going through, like putting little notes out for her parents. She said something that reminded me why I got into this business of working with adolescents to begin with. I have often felt that adolescents are misunderstood and invalidated or not always taken seriously. And I really liked how Dessa pointed that out. She was able to reflect on her own adolescence and youth because she's a real person with real feelings that meant something right then and there at that time in her life. And the experiences that adolescents have are real. They're right there, happening right then in that time of their life. And I hope that people take youth seriously as they're trying to struggle with their own feelings and thoughts and, who they are and the needs that they have. Dessa was really fortunate to have a really supportive family network, both in her mother and father. And while she talked about maybe her mother struggling a little bit more with being there for her always, Dessa was really clear about the ways that her parents were tracking her and trying to provide help and support to her when she needed that. And that is just a true gift. And she also recognized her privilege that she always had a safe place to sleep. And she was able to recognize that not everybody is fortunate in that way. And I've noticed that a couple of our guests have mentioned the privilege that they have had in their life as they have tried to navigate their mental health. And it's just nice that they're able to recognize that. Mental health really can be impacted by the other struggles that we have in our life: job security, food security, other family challenges. And it's just so much more of a struggle for people when not only are they navigating the basic needs in life, but then to navigate mental health on top of that is such a challenge. The other thing that I want to point out is that Dessa's experience included people integrating her physical health with mental health. And research is actually showing that gets better results when providers look at the entire person and see everything that's impacting them. And I really appreciated her experience that she referenced with Dr. Rush and how thorough he was. And it's such a great example of a good provider when you're willing to ask all the questions, do a deep assessment, and look at somebody's entire life and not just jump to conclusions. Something else struck me. I like Dessa's approach to talking about mental health and what that means. She has a really nice way of making it clear that having a diagnosis or calling it mental health isn't really what's important. She clearly was able to just look at her own feelings, her thoughts, and understand what was going on for herself and what she needed. So regardless of the diagnosis, she was willing to dig in to what was happening for her and to just be with it and to address it. So you don't always have to have a mental health diagnosis. You don't have to believe your diagnosis. You don't have to analyze yourself in a mental health framework to still recognize that you have feelings or that you have serious thoughts or issues going on in your own life that need to be addressed. So hang in there, do what Dessa did, and just continue being curious. Dessa was extremely curious about her own thoughts and feelings and what was going on. And she was a bit relentless in terms of just digging in and figuring that stuff out for herself. In This Family is produced by John Moe, and the music is provided by Jeremy Messersmith. You can learn more about Nexus by visiting nexusfamilyhealing.org. Thanks again for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, I hope you recommend it to your family and friends. Please hit subscribe and post about us on social media and leave a rating or review. So this brings us to the end of season 1. Thanks so much for listening and supporting the show. I'll be back soon in the new year with new episodes featuring amazing guests and some surprises too. Have a great winter.